Hello, Professor French. My name is Gioia, and I am here today to discuss my research essay with you, which is called Indigenous Slavery in New France and Beyond. I am from the city of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, a beautiful city which is located on the St. Mary's River, which borders the U.S., and is surrounded by 3 First Nation reserves: Garden River, Rankin, and Batchewana. I have some good friends that live on those reserves, and to be honest, I really did not know the full story behind the reserves and why they live there. Through this history course, I have learned more than I really ever have through my education in history about enslaving of the Indigenous and the hardships these people, along with Africans, endured throughout North America. Of course, their hardships continue throughout history, but the story of the chattel slavery that we learned about in school or saw in movies or read in books often did not include Indigenous people, when in reality, Indigenous slavery took place concurrently with African slavery. Because I want to learn more and perhaps even educate others, I plan on concentrating the focus on my essay first on colonization and its effects on people, specifically on the Indigenous, and then go throughout history of the European colonial powers who all participated in the Indian slave trade. I will discuss the origins of Indigenous slavery in early America and include facts throughout my essay, such as the number of Indigenous and the European enslaved, which is pretty significant. I think it's important to include Canada's role in chattel slavery. I learned that Canada is prided for their role in the 1800s as a land of freedom for those American black slaves escaping slavery through an underground railroad system. I think it's important to highlight Canada in my research essay. Throughout my research essay, I found an interesting case known as the Robin versus Hardaway Freedom Indian suit, which challenged the legal right to own slaves in Virginia in 1772. This case started a rise in similar cases which began the debate on whether slavery was even legal. I will also address how race played a role in these freedom of suits, especially those that alleged white ancestors. I plan to include a section on the enslavement of Indigenous women. I think this is important to address realities that the Native women experienced during this time period, which included being given to soldiers as rewards in village raids or bartered for the exchange of goods. I've learned that most enslaved Native Americans were women and children because they were worth more. One journal I recently found, Narrative of Nancy, a Cherokee woman. This narrative gives the reader a vivid account of what took place from the moment of a young Native girl that was taken from her home and her family. In my research, I found that the children of Native slaves and what happened to them was just as important. And this is why I added "and beyond" to my research paper title. As his story takes place in New England, in this clip from a YouTube video, Native American Slave Trade in New England, I really found this story of Orson, a Native boy born into a Native slave whose father was his white master, both interesting and educational. It confirms that these children fell into a life of slavery, not by choice. With no identity, no last name, they just existed to work to make their masters rich.
To illustrate the nature of indentured servitude and show how it functioned as a substitute for slavery of native people in 18th century New England, we present the case of Orson, a young Indian man bound in servitude in 1764 for 70 years to English colonist Elias Thompson. In New England history, Orson's story spans the time from the devastation of King Philip's War, 1675 and 6, when thousands of Narragansett were killed or enslaved, to illegal detribalization of the Narragansett people by the state of Rhode Island in 1880. Orson's story fits within two overlapping contexts: colonial conquest and oppression of native people by English colonists, and the Narragansett people's resistance, dispersion, and survival in the face of English colonization. I want to look at a couple key features of the indenture. Orson was identified by first name only, as was his mother. It was common in American slavery for masters to drop the family names of those they enslaved. It was also common for English colonists to eliminate the family names of native people in the records, so that Fleetfoot of the Fox clan became Fleetfoot, for example, a form of documentary genocide that effectively terminated the existence of the clan in record. As was customary in the English records of enslaved people, Orson was identified by race, a mustee fellow. Record keepers in 18th century Rhode Island used the term mustee to signify native ancestry, but in a limiting way, to deny full native ancestry and to indicate a non-native parent. In this case, we conclude that Orson did indeed have a non-native parent, Elias Thompson. Orson was son to mustee woman that is commonly called Old Hitty. Hitty had lived with and labored for Isaac Thompson's family. Orson would live and labor for Elias Thompson's family. Orson had come to his bondage through his mother, as was the case with most native children bound out to English masters in 18th century New England. This child inherited his mother's condition.
My views have definitely broadened on this subject matter. I really have an appreciation of the difficulty natives had even back then for survival. The ruthless behavior of mankind to use other humans to achieve their goals is unimaginable. It seems that anyone who could profit from this act did so. From how I see it, natives were enslaved because they were simply native people, and to the Europeans, there was no better people in this creation of this planet
than themselves.
And this continued until after the American War of Independence in 1775, when the African slaves became more popular per se, and worth more than the natives, who were also dying of disease and infections. They were first taken as prisoners of war in North America, and after the English arrived, but were then captured and sold in plantations. How I understand it, the native slaves were looking for hard labor and were forced out of their lands and brought far away to work plantations so that the owners could avoid retaliation. What else I have learned from my research? Well, slavery made people rich. It made them rich as others suffered the consequences. I believe that the Europeans who came to Canada destroyed all the First Nations' way of life. They were the first ones in Canada. They lost all of their land and were forced to live in isolated reserves. But most importantly, they lost their identity because they were seen as savages and their lifestyle was not welcomed at all. European colonization destroyed the First Nations' way of life and caused mistrust, anger, and a lot of resentment, which still exists today. Really, when you think about it, even enslavement is illegal today. It still happens in different forms whereby people are stripped from their culture and forced to live as what the white man defines the norm. We see it all the time in the media, where organizations represent First Nations are always fighting to protect their culture and their rights. I'll end it with a quote. The real names of our people were destroyed during slavery. The last names of my forefathers was taken from them when they were brought to America and made slaves. And then name of the slave master was given, which we refuse. We reject the name today and refuse it. I never acknowledge it whatsoever. Malcolm X.